Here is Sailor Studio 435, a purple ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
Here we have a very pleasant purple on the page, which is great because some of the studio inks were a bit disappointing, though there's a long way to go on them. There is some tone variation by nib, and yes, it does shade, but only if you have the right pen and paper. So it's not a huge shader. You don't have that match and you just don't get it. There is general good performance that doesn't disappoint, even on non-fountain pen friendly paper. I frequently enjoy purple inks more than I enjoy blues, and whenever I can use them. This one, I think I enjoyed a little bit more than a bunch of the purples that I have used. And I've used a lot of purples, so that says something for this. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib that writes rather dry. A Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet. A Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow. A Lamy All-Star with a broad nib that writes average.
The pen for today is a Lamy 2000.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the lightest tone that we're going to get with this ink. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get some shading, thankfulness, on the third line. You see that the T is lighter than the H, which is quite a bit darker. The A goes in the A, dark, comes out light. The K, a little bit darker than the N, and the F, a little bit darker than the K. It lightens up in the fullness until the two S's at the end, where it does start to get quite a bit darker. And we see shading like this throughout quite a bit of the soft fine writing, so it shades pretty well with that nib. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We get a beautiful, very dark purple that has almost no shading or tone variation, though some can be discovered if you go looking for it, like discovered on the third line. As a word, looks a little bit lighter than some of the words around it, but I wouldn't count on this being really a big shader throughout the writing as you do it. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine. We get no feathering. We get no spread. We get, I think, a little nicer tone than we had with the wet fine. It's still a nice dark purple. I did like how dark that purple was from the wet fine, but I think what we're getting here is just a little bit nicer. It's a very dark looking purple with little hints of shading throughout it. Not a ton, but if you look at another on the first line, her at the end is a little bit darker than the anot at the beginning. Again, on the second line, the N is darker than the rest of the word. So we do get some shading. I think it comes through very nice. The most standout thing to me is the tone of this purple that it's putting on the page. Looking at the broad nib, it is a whole lot lighter than it was with the medium. Tad bit darker, I think, maybe almost the same tone. We'll call it the same tone as the soft fine. Just the broader lines make it easier to really stand out. There's no feathering, there's no spread. There is shading that is not particularly hard to find. Look at the on the first line. He is darker than the T that starts it, though then it becomes harder to find. And you only get really dots or commas or the D at the end of fine in that downstroke where it is darker. It's a nice tone. I was expecting a little more shading here. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same performance that we had on the Clairfontaine. Same tone, no feather, no spread, light bits of shading that go on. Take a look at Thirst on the first line, where the TH is a little bit darker. It lightens up into the RST at the end. Even the cross of the T, which is normally a bit darker, is lighter in itself. So it's nice in what's happening. If you look at Staggered on the second line, the STA is a nice mid-tone, lightens up on the first G. During the second G, especially that downstroke, it gets much darker, lightening up again until we get to the D where it darkens during the downstroke. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. A tad bit, well, maybe just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, but it's flatter as a tone, which also makes it look like a slightly purple leaning blue. Still an interesting tone that we're getting on the page. Very nice. No feather, no spread. Shading, yes, a tiny bit. It's not a never thing when you look at never on the third line. It is certainly lighter than the word path directly above it. So there's some, it's not a standout feature, but it wasn't standout on the Clairfontaine. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine, a little lighter, a little flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get nothing for shading, where the Clairfontaine did show some shading, not so much here, but we do still have a beautiful darker purple. I just tend to enjoy how well this paper does with fountain pen inks. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium nib. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. We still get no feathering. We still get no spread. We get almost nothing for shading, but we had almost nothing for shading on the Clairfontaine, so we can't be disappointed in what it's doing here. It's giving a nice mid-purple tone that doesn't make me feel like magenta, because sometimes purples do that. This is definitely not. Looking at the back of the page, you can see that in the medium nib, it got very deep into the paper. Though it wasn't really a problem, there is some minor ghosting going on. Could you write back here? That's going to be a you choice. I think with the soft fine, you have no issues, but any of the others, you might want to consider whether or not you'd write back here.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, little bit more of a blue look than a purple. We get no feathering and we get no spread. I think the shading here shows up a little bit nicer than it did on the Clairfontaine, yet there's that color shift towards it being very blue leaning, at least as I'm seeing it here. Shading, look at L's. The top of the L is a little bit darker and the downstroke of the S is a little bit darker. Called on the third line, the C is darker than the A. First L stays light, second L into the E is darker. The beginning of the D lightens a little bit. Up and downstroke of that D darkens some, so it shades very well on this paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread, no shading, not really looking like a super dark purple here the way it did on the Clairfontaine, but more like a very dark blue, really still having an effect of this paper on the ink. Kind of disappointing. Not saying it doesn't look to have some purple. It looks like a very dark blue with a purple lean. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, also more purple than I was expecting based on the last two writing. No feather, no spread. Yes, it shades. I think it shades a little bit better than it did on the Clairfontaine as a result of this paper. Look at had on the first line. The H is very dark. The A is lighter than that. Going into the D, it lightens up even more. Wood starts lighter and works its way darker throughout the word. This is doing, I think, very nicely here. As long as you don't mind that kind of blue lean to it, I think we have a nice paper for this. Looking at the broad nib, the most noticeable thing is you don't really see a blue lean. It's very much a purple. So the broad nib on this paper really makes the color look its best. It is lighter, or the best on this paper. It is lighter than it was with the medium. It is about as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, though slightly altered in color, not showing it, just it's a slightly different purple. No feather, no spread. Yes, it shades. I think it shades about as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, meaning you can spot some areas like the Y in simply on the first line, or D in stopped. If you go down to the third line, the L in Bilbo is a little bit darker than the rest of it. You just get little spots like that where it is slightly darker than the rest. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding. We don't have no ghosting. We have minimal ghosting, so I think you could easily write back here.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get shading just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Not that that's a tremendous surprise. Generally, these papers perform very, very similar. The biggest difference, or the biggest reason I like looking at this, is the quad rule. This ink stands out from the quad rule. It's not visually distracting that this is the paper that I'm using, which I think stands very well for the ink. Something else I'm noticing is sometimes inks, when it hits the print on the paper, that causes little skip marks. Didn't happen. A very opaque ink, at least, or more opaque than I was expecting based on the color change from the last paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading. It's very dark and it's hard to really get shading when that happens. I think we have a very nice tone on this paper, very dark purple, which there's a whole group of people that love those super dark purples. Have to choose the right pen for that one. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the medium. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get little bits of shading, just as we had on the Clairfontaine. Not much difference. Look at much difference on the second line, where much starts lighter on the M, starts getting darker on the U, really darkens up at that last H. Difference starts lighter at the diff, N, but it's the CE at the end that does get much darker. So you do get to really see some of that. And again, when I'm saying it's lighter and darker here, it's in shades of dark. Looking at the broad nib, it is a whole lot lighter than it was in the medium. The same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We get almost nothing for shading. You get the dot of the I in going on the second line, or the downstroke of the T of not on the first line, a comma. Other than that, not a whole lot, but it performs basically the same as it did with the Clairfontaine. Looking at the back of the page, we have no shockers with no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Graf von Faber-Castell Violet Blue.
Here is Gerbon Coco do Brazil. Here is Levenger Amethyst. Here is
Private Reserve Infinity Purple. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little darker than it was with the Clairfontaine, and I think the purple looks a little more purpley. I don't know that that's a great description, but it is the description I'm going with. We have no feathering, we have no spread. This paper typically does well with fountain pens, and it's doing well here. We do have shading, and I do think the shading shows up nicer here than it did on the Clairfontaine, I think as a result of this off-white that the paper is. Look at the D in wood or could on the first line, a bit darker than the rest of the word. The HE in torches on the second line, little darker. The on the second line is darker than the words around it. Even elves, it seems like the E and the bottom of the L are light, the top are dark. The top of the L is a bit lighter. The V is a little darker, but the ES lighten up just a little bit. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a little darker than it was with the soft fine, a whole lot lighter and flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We still have no feathering, we still have no spread, we still have no shading. It's like a dark blue purple that's happening again here as a result of the paper. Other than that, I would say that what's going on is very nice. Looking at the medium nib, it is just as dark as it was with the wet fine, but the tone is a little different. It's showing more purple with a slight blue lean. It's just showing more purple, really. And I'm hoping it comes through well on camera. Quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread. Light bits of shading do show up throughout, but this is not a paper that you're using really expecting the shading to show up well, so anytime anything shows up, it's kind of a bonus. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. I want to say that the broad has been really a consistent tone, slight variation from paper to paper, but really consistent in its tone and showing off of this color. I don't know if I said it, but no feathering, no spread, only a couple moments of shading, not something you use this paper for, so it's doing very well. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily write back here.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Diamine Sherwood Green. Here is Lamy Agate. Here is Zenzoi Pink. Here is Califolio Bouton d'Or.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, showing some of that blue lean that seems to show up on some of the papers. Yes, it feathers ever so slightly. You see it on the word steam on the second line. You see it on thrust on the third line. You see it whenever it looks a little bit darker. So yes, it is shading some, like the T in feet on the first line or the TRE of stream on the second line. So it does shade some, but it's just Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine nib. It does feather and it does spread. It does not shade. It looks not purple. In person, I'm hoping this all works out on camera. In person, it looks like a dark turquoise blue leaning over a purple. I'm not seeing the purple really come through well, though. That's just here, me. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We do get feathering and we do get spread. We do not get shading. Most noticeable thing going on here is the purple that we're getting is not dissimilar to the purple we were getting from the broad on other papers, though it is a little bit darker. So I think the tone that's happening here is incredibly nice considering the paper we're working on. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, but not a whole lot lighter than the Clairfontaine. Yes, it feathers. Yes, it spreads. No, it does not shade. It does show how nicely that broad has really performed through all of these papers because, again, the tone is still really consistent. Looking at the back of the page, I don't think this is too bad. Sure, the ink gets very deep into the paper. I don't think you could write back here. Nothing bled through to the other side, but I don't think this is too bad. I'm pretty impressed with how it did on the junk papers.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper. The dry soft fine is the lightest tone with some decent shading from time to time. The wet fine is the darkest tone and almost, that is, no shading. The medium flow medium nib is just a tad bit lighter than the wet fine, but the purple shows best with some light shading going on. The broad is a little bit darker than the soft fine, just a tad, but shows off the color with some shading. I think maybe some of the best on premium papers of the pens used, and it's been a very consistent color performance throughout most of the papers. For me, the nib and flow the medium flow on the medium nib really looked the best, showing a beautiful dark purple that shaded to an almost black purple, beautiful to look at on the page. So while that broad was the most consistent in how it looked as it was going down, the medium really just stood out to me as something especially nice with this ink.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.